So it's that time of year again when we've had our hands on the newest COD title, but also probably on more platforms than we may have expected. The current generation of consoles launched in 2020, but still 4 years later, here we are. So how do these versions of the game stack up against each other? That's what we're taking a look at today. PC versus PlayStation versus Xbox Series X versus PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Drop your thoughts if any of the results may surprise you. What do you think of the versions and anything in between? If you enjoyed the video, do me a huge favor and drop a like. These are some of my favorite videos to make, so I do hope you enjoy this. And of course, make sure to subscribe for more Black Ops 6 coverage as we gear up for Weekend 2 here in a few days, and of course, the full launch later beyond. I'd love to have you in the community as we chase down 600,000 subscribers. But for now, let's take a look at the versions of Black Ops 6 and their generational differences. So a few baseline items, a few sort of like housekeeping rules on how this is going to be handled. The platforms tested were a high-end PC with a 4090 AMD Ryzen 9 7950X, a PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, a PlayStation 4 Pro, and a launch Xbox One. So that last gen, there's kind of taking a look at the two differences between the last generations, the mid-generation and the very beginning of the generation, and then we're going to be taking a look at and comparing things like the textures between platforms, the performance of the game on each of these platforms, and things like that. Now, in this video, you'll see a lot of subtle differences perhaps, but one thing that you'll see that's standard across every single platform is the overly abundant warnings of voice chat, recording, and moderation is active to create a safe environment for players in accordance with the code of conduct. Brother, I get it the first 50 times, I understand. Do it like once, maybe when we boot up the game and queue in for the first time if you want to drill it into us, but not every single match, and I still wouldn't care for it even then. But jokes aside, let's take a look at PC first. When it comes down to simple texture quality, the graphics of the game, the overall look, this is the best that it can possibly be for a various number of reasons. The biggest being the customization features you have here at this. If you want to crank up the graphics on your PC, you absolutely can. All consoles are built for like a universal set of outputs. It's a convenience thing. Like if you were cooking your own burger, you could decide what temperature you wanted the meat cooked at, any spices you wanted in the meat, what kind of bun you wanted it on, how many pickles, if you wanted lettuce or onion, how much ketchup, mustard, or other condiments you wanted on it. Whereas if you ordered a burger from a fast food chain, there's a set number of ingredients for every single one of those hundreds that pass through the building that day. Same concept. You have so much more total control over the game on PC, and depending on your hardware, upscaling and sharpening, your DLSS or Fidelity FX CAS and such, your render resolution, your texture resolutions, yeah, there's a lot of options compared to console that naturally can make the game look much, much better. So in that sense, in terms of the five, it is by far the best you can get graphically speaking. Color quality, sharpness, all that looks really good, I think. Performance, as with the graphics and the overall look of the game, the performance section is going to be something that naturally is just, it's better. Depending on the hardware and what you can push out, you're going to far exceed that 120 Hz potential for frame rate in Black Ops 6 on, say, just like PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X, with a high potential of doing it at the same, if not a higher quality than that of console. If you're playing at 120 Hz at 1080p or 1440p, you can probably do that with a solid PC rig upwards of 4K, maybe even, depending on if you have like some god tier rig, maybe 8K. Probably not 99.99% of players, but you get the point here at this. But you're going to end up having that be playing buttery smooth here. A lot of the feel comes down to button layouts and stuff like that, user inputs, but in terms of actual performance pushing the game, PC's still going to be your sort of pinnacle here at this. For your current generation of consoles, again, not everyone has a multi-$1,000 PC. It's just not practical nor worth it in 99% of cases, especially for the average player. But that's where consoles come into play, and since 2020, again, PlayStation 5's and Xbox Series X has been that top of the respective platform offering and performance. We aren't going to talk about a Series S here just because we're trying to take a look at the best of what the generations have on offer. The S is that kind of like mid-tier one offered at the generational launch, but just as sort of peeking out what the Xbox can do right now, we're taking a look at the Series X. These platforms, while not as powerful as the highest end PCs, they do just fine and are still able to output the highest possible casual experience, graphics, and performance that by every measurable metric is still in the top percentiles of device playback and engagement. So just again, not in those maybe like severe top 1% of systems per se. Starting with PlayStation 5, let's talk about the texture quality and overall look here of this graphically. For all current generation consoles, it's gonna look good. These are what the games are geared towards in development. When you compare it directly to PC, you'll notice mostly some of the textures like the sharpness and definition in trees and leaves. Perhaps some of the foliage and grass textures on the maps like Derelict are a little bit off. They don't have as much sharpness, they're not as detailed, but for the most part the game looks and runs great. This year, I actually think that they did a really good job when it comes to the quality of textures between PC and the PlayStation 5 versions, and I want to reference and inspect on the XM4 in the training course as an example to take a look at some of these details. For a retail version, it's nice to see that you have the attention to detail on things like stock scratches, textures on the rope around the stock, text on the side of the weapon, defined depth on the wrap of the barrel, and things like that. There's more to it, but again, that's just some basic sort of, hey, check these out mentions. Performance-wise, the game plays just fine, exactly how you'd expect it or want it to. Of course, networking and things like packet bursts from weekend one certainly are an issue to consider, but when we talk about the platform capabilities, that's a Call of Duty issue, not a console performance one. 60 FPS or 120 FPS, depending on your monitor and your supported outputs, seem to be entirely stable, which is definitely nice. Personally, for me, I was playing my PS5 while recording this on 60 Hz, so I only ended up having 60 FPS, but you can go higher than that. But it gets the job done and is a textbook version of what the development of a PS5 can be for COD titles. Like, it's on par with everything you'd expect for current generation of a game. Now, Xbox Series X, let's talk about this a little bit here at this. Texture quality and overall look-wise, graphically speaking, while it's a current generation console, it's also something that for the last few years I've noticed this as well. It's not just a Black Ops 6 issue, that it looks great on its own, but if you compare it with PlayStation or PC, the default color range is a bit more washed out, I feel. That's not a huge deal and something you may not notice unless you see this video or something like this that showcases things back to back, and frankly, it's an easy fix if it ends up bothering you, that it's just something you have to adjust some of the monitor or console settings for your color outputs, but it's definitely something that was immediately apparent to me when I was editing this video. Graphically on its own though, same thing goes with the PS5. It's what you'd want out of an Xbox COD title in modern day, definitely keeping up and holding its own. I think that without wanting to wade into any sort of console wars because I think they're just incredibly stupid, both platforms are great in their own right, but I do think that graphically speaking, the PS5 has just an ever so slightly edge over the Xbox Series X in its output. Texture differences you might see, things can appear a bit softer in regards to the definition of things, like the same frame from that PS5 inspect of the XM4 that we talked about. Those same points of detail that we mentioned, like the scratches, the depth of the wrap, the text on the side of the weapon, all that stuff isn't so sharp to a degree. Like, you can't really make out the wording on the side, and you can't really see any of the depth to the scratches and so on. So like on the surface, it does not have any sort of differences, but when you zoom in to see the minute details, that's when you'll see them. Performance-wise, same thing with PlayStation 5. The gameplay feels just fine, exactly how you'd want it to or expect it to. Again, 60 or 120 FPS, entirely up to you, but it did end up performing up to those standards. And of my time recording this, I didn't really notice any issues, performance-wise at least. I absolutely suck with an Xbox controller. I think the Elite for the Xbox Series X feels like my hands are just way too big and I'm button mashing everything. So personally speaking, I didn't have a great time on it, but in terms of the platform itself, again, nothing really wrong with how the game can be run. But now let's get to the interesting parts here. Last generation. The PlayStation 4 Pro, or Jet Engine Simulator as some others would call it. Despite the PlayStation 5 launching in fall of 2020, nearly 4 years later, the population on last gen is surprisingly even with the current gen. So it's possible that this could be a viable option here for you. While there were hardware shortages that led to the limited availability of next-gen consoles at the time, an even split and staggering 49 million monthly active users on PlayStation 4 have been reported as of recently. 4 years after the launch of that console seems kind of wild, right? To me, it does, but hey, I mean, it actually lends weight to why this game is still being actively supported for platforms that seemingly to us may be outdated. Because at this point, we're kind of in uncharted territory for how the performance of a game will go. The last generational shift and share was with the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 10 plus years ago, where the air quote last gen at that point was abandoned after 3 years, but not before it granted us the memes of the cursed versions of Black Ops 3. But anyways, on PlayStation 4 and respectively the Xbox One upcoming, you will definitely notice there are performance hits, graphical differences, and all. Really, I'm not sure if the PlayStation 4 was a stable 60 FPS at times. There were noticeable lags when I opened up the scoreboard on mine, but without access to any sort of console-specific tracking tools for FPS, I can't be sure 100%. But in regards to how the game looks, this is where, again, you'll start to see some of those noticeable differences. Quality is less in depth, not as many high-res textures included, just because I'd wager they were getting to the cap of what could become a stable build. One of the fun facts out there is that things like Blackout back in Black Ops 4, there was that season where everything went to like nighttime and stuff. And I don't know if you guys remember, but windows were actually removed from buildings at that point. That wasn't an artistic vision or anything like that. It's just because they were pushing the ceiling of what the game could do so close that something as simple as windows around the map created instability. So that might be the case here with this, but you'll see noticeably more, I guess, bare, you could say, sort of textures around the map. Not as much detail, less sharp images. The foliage and the trees are all a bit more generic and not including as many individual leaves and such, but frankly, it's not nearly as bad as I was anticipating. It honestly reminds me of if you'd want to play a game on PC on lower graphical settings to increase your frame rate. Something kind of that nature. The maps don't look to differ too much. Visibility itself isn't obstructed a ton. We'll talk about how it is in just a second, but it's just a matter of some areas don't look as detailed as others. Performance-wise, again, aside from the mentioned jet engine that could take off and the hitching when you open the scoreboard, it wasn't all that bad. As mentioned, without any specific tracking tools to see console FPS outputs, it may have slipped below 60 FPS, but it wasn't anything that was insanely noticeable during my time playing. This console's not necessarily the prime target for the game's peak performance, but playable no less if you do end up having this. And again, if you are a part of those reported 49 million monthly active users on PlayStation 4 still, it is an option to end up playing. And finally, taking the last step through our history of the platform supported here, the Xbox One, which launched on November 22nd, 2013, celebrating its 11th birthday here later this year. Graphically speaking, when you load it up, you might think, okay, not all that bad because it's menu items. Those load-in animations, those videos that play in the background, it's all video files in the game itself, but it's by far the worst compared to platforms today when you get in-game. I'm certainly not saying to go out and buy a console today, especially for something as trivial in the overall gaming landscape as COD, but if you have one and you want to try it out, well, you're probably going to run into some overall frustrations and problems. As for the quality, the overall look, you take that washed out sort of softness on the visuals that we mentioned with the Xbox Series X, and then you bring it down a peg and mix it in with the fact that it's last gen with a lack of high quality assets to run to, and that's essentially what the Black Ops 6 Xbox One version is. Trees are just blurred blobs in the distance, some walls are about as bland and textureless as you can be without it just being a block out version of the level, but with the original consoles, not only do you get just the sort of more bland approach to how this looks, the not as pretty looking visuals in Call of Duty, but it also comes down to starting to be a genuine visibility issue. For example, take a look at this clip on Rewind. If I stop it right before I start getting shot at, can you tell me where the enemy that initiates fire comes from? Maybe if you really zoom in you can, but in the moment, when you have a literal half second to adjust, aim, and fire back, you probably wouldn't be able to spot that player. But if that enemy was on anything current gen or even a PC running at like 4K extreme textures like I normally do, they'd be able to see me perfectly. That character model is plain as day, and probably you'd be able to make out the specific operator that I was in that distance. So while I don't think this is necessarily like cursed levels of Black Ops 3, it is the closest that we've been in this generational shift since Modern Warfare 2's launch to something that is cursed. The last 3 years that we've taken a look at what should have probably been deviations from last generation, it is something that this is probably what I would say the most noticeable at this point. Performance-wise, outside of using a controller that had a sitting dead zone of 64, meaning that the controller will literally just always be scrolling up or down depending on where I bump it last, up or down, the performance of the game was just about as you'd expect. Certainly the lowest of the performance, more hitching can be felt. Even in some of the menus where it's just character models like the operator selection menu, you'd see that that was probably skipping at around like 30 FPS, maybe less. Same with the simple walking animations that would happen on the main MP menu. You'd notice that it's skipping a little bit, it's not as fluid in those spots. So gameplay-wise, it's not the best choice to use a near 11-year-old console, which of course makes sense. That's probably what you expected jumping into this video. But anyways, let's talk about the overall sort of generational differences to a Black Ops 6 degree. Not necessarily just per console now at this point, but one thing that I like to talk about every single year, I saved it a little later on in the video because if you don't care about it, it's not something that really is all that big an issue for you, but water caustics is one of those factors that I love to touch on every single time we do this kind of stuff, because while the last 2 years we've done this comparison, rightfully people have been like, why does this guy love water so much? I simply like to look at this kind of stuff because it is hard to do in games. Consistently one of the toughest things to nail in game dev in looking natural. So how does the water react comparatively between platforms and frankly, games? If we're taking a look at each of these sort of things platform to platform. This is one of those things that while water isn't necessarily really big in any of the MP maps that we have right now, if there's water in other maps at launch, you'll probably notice it more. But from PC down the line, you can see noticeable differences. When shooting, you'll notice that the bullet ripple dispersion is less and less defined, getting down to last gen where it's really just like a texture image of ripples rather than actual ripples, that the water's not actually interacting with that ballistic item. The way the water interacts with the world isn't as fluid in the older versions either. Instead, just being kind of like an invisible texture barrier almost, if that makes sense. Like you can't see beneath the surface of that water, and almost as if it's a sharp-edged PNG would be coming ashore. You see that stark contrast way more compared to PC and the extreme textures. This is also super noticeable if you try to take any sort of swim in the water. Granted, you only have 2 seconds to do so because all the water in the map is out of bounds and kills you after that period of time, but you'll notice that the current generation is a lot more detailed and has a lot more feeling of actually being submerged in the environment, while last gen is more so just like more rocks and base of the level underneath almost a different skybox. Now, game to game, this is one that kind of surprised me a little bit. While we have what is, in theory, the most progressed of the developmental product in this game on the new engine, I do kind of feel like, at least at first glance, from what we've seen in the beta, that the water in like Modern Warfare 3 was more reactive to a degree. And yes, you kind of have to take into account that we don't really have stable water within the Black Ops 6 beta. The pool on Skyline is the closest thing we have, but there's also a lot of variables that go into that. So while the Shores of Protocol and Training Course are rough waters, I feel like what we could make out of the sort of moments of gentle stillness in that water, it looked a little bit more reactive and fluid in Modern Warfare 3. Grand scheme of things, water doesn't matter to 99.9% of players who play the game. It's just one of those things that developmentally is impressive if you can nail it. So I'd like to take a bit of time to discuss that. Then finally, the graphical fidelity overall in terms of the game. I'm not generally a fan of the COD HQ, but I will say that having spoken with devs in the past about the goals and intentions of it, it is, I think, pretty clear that everyone is on the same sort of baseline to work with. And I think that's helping a little bit, at least, to keep that gap from not being unplayable to a degree. Like we mentioned, the Black Ops 3 version on 360 and PlayStation 3, those were kind of memed to all hell and back. They were cursed versions of the game. I don't think we're quite there yet. PC, I'd still obviously say is the top choice, but that's the difference in a few $1,000 gaming rig and a few hundred of consoles. When it comes to off-the-shelf gaming experiences, obviously the current gen holds up and I think looks pretty good. And I feel like the overall art direction of this game this year isn't necessarily the top of the mountain for graphics, but that's kind of always been a Treyarch thing, a more cartoony feel where it's not 100% realism based, but utilizing that new COD engine where the basis of it was built for Modern Warfare. Obviously, you're going to have a lot more in regards to quality, even if that art direction takes a little bit of a turn and goes more cartoony. So I think this is a nice graphical upgrade to like Cold War or something, but I also feel like if you were to take extreme levels of maybe Modern Warfare 2019, Modern Warfare 2, you might see some comparative differences here, and maybe it's subjective in which one looks better than the other. But all in all, that is the Black Ops 6 versions on PC, Xbox Series X, PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. So let me know your thoughts down below. Any of these surprise you? Any of the results that we have out of these platforms stand out? Whatever the case, drop your thoughts. If you guys enjoyed the video, you found it at all insightful, do me a favor and drop a like on it. And if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe to a single thing regarding all things Black Ops 6. We've got a lot upcoming still that I would love to share with you guys and would love to have in the community for. So if you'd like to join us on that road to 600,000 subscribers, I'd love to have you in the community. But for now, thanks so much for watching. My name has been Espresso. I'll see you later. Take care and peace.